All we need is joints, money, and a scientist willing to speak Ebonics, and we're going to jump right on this vaccine thing, aren't we?
Excuse me. All right, move on. Nothing to see here. Please disperse. Nothing to see here, please.
So you mean to tell me there are populations who are too white to get this vaccine before Black people? They're willing to compel poor people to take the vaccine with monetary incentives, aka monetary punishments. There are institutions that want to give out free weed to convince people to take the vaccine. Countries have been caught putting HIV in a vaccine that they plan to peddle to Black people.
Test of emergency alert system capabilities. This test message has been initiated by National Alert and Warning Authorities.
And our people are more susceptible to vaccine injury than any other group.
In coordination with emergency alert system participants, including broadcast, cable, satellite, and wireline participants in your area.
Am I missing something here?
Had this been an actual emergency, the attention signal you just heard would have been followed by emergency information, news, or instructions.
Or are we going to keep pretending that we don't see what's happening?
This is only a test. We now return you to regular programming.
Federal law allows citizens to reproduce, distribute, or exhibit portions of copyrighted motion pictures, videotapes, or video discs under certain circumstances without authorization of the copyright holder. This is called fair use and is allowed for purposes of criticism, news reporting, teaching, and parody, which doesn't infringe of copyright under 17 U.S.C. 107.
This is a pretty involved video, so I'm gonna try to move as quickly as I can and jam it full of information. Unfortunately, I'm not gonna be able to cover every little thing that I really want to cover in this video. I'll have further discussions about this on my memberships page and Patreon. I also want to be careful what I say in open forum because, as we know, the censorship police are in full effect. With that said, I'm just going to dive right into this conversation. I have so much to discuss. I really don't even know where to start. But I guess I want to start with the targeting of Black people and the poor, which are mostly Black people. I think the best place to start is just a couple of facts about this vaccine. Number one, when we talk about the Moderna vaccine specifically, it's important to note that their clinical trial included 45 people. You heard me right. 45 people. 45 people over a 2-month trial. And now they're peddling this vaccine to many individuals. And it's not just that 45 people for 2 months were the only people they tried this vaccine on before massively distributing it. It's also that a significant portion of those people had adverse side effects, many of which required hospitalization. And it can't go without saying that these 45 people were in peak physical health. They weren't even allowed to have any health issues to participate in this study. It also has to be said that we have companies peddling vaccines who have never, and I mean ever, made a human vaccine before. And yet we're supposed to get shot up with a vaccine that only 45 people have been tested on. A significant portion of them became ill. None of them had pre-existing medical conditions. And all this from a company that has never, ever produced a vaccine for people. Ever. So they don't have any experience in what they're doing.
There's nothing to worry about. I'm a professional.
Professional what?
But okay, we add to this mire of scientific confusion the fact that they are shifting the target population for this very, very experimental vaccine to Black people. And there are even people coming forward who work closely with the CDC, such as Harold Schmidt, a so-called ethics and health policy expert at the University of Pennsylvania, who has started to speak to the CDC about how some populations are too white to be the first on the menu to get this experimental vaccine. Yeah, you heard that correctly. Some populations are too white. Let's talk about these populations that are so very white, they should not get the vaccine first, even though, we're in a health emergency. Apparently teachers should not get the vaccine first. Why, you might ask? Well, because most of American teachers are white. Most of them are white women. The next highest proportion are white men. And because the target populations who are most vulnerable, people like me and you, aren't represented in that class, they really want to move teachers off of the virus fast track because they're too white. Oh, but it doesn't stop there. Remember the elderly and how much danger the elderly are in of getting this virus? Well, apparently the elderly population is also too white to get the vaccine. Because you see, Black people are so medically disenfranchised that we aren't represented in significant numbers in the elderly population. So now old people and teachers are too white to get the vaccine first. Dr. Peter Ziegler, if that's how you pronounce his name, he's come forward from his stoop as a committee member and professor of pediatrics at the University of California in Los Angeles. And he has stepped forward to let us know that we need to focus on populations that are Black and minority and poor and get them the vaccine. And we should rework our idea of what essential worker is to specifically include low-income workers who are minorities and have low education. Those people totally need the vaccine first. He admits these populations are disproportionately Black and brown, and so we need to pump them full of it first, not all these majority white populations. So let's bring ourselves up to speed. We have a vaccination that was tested on 45 people for 2 months, being peddled by a company who has never, ever, ever created a human vaccine before. And all this was done in the space of 2 months. And the conversation is now shifting from giving it to elderly people, teachers, and all essential workers to not giving it to certain populations because they're too white, but focusing on low income, minority, low educated, undesirables in society. Okay, but it gets better because we have some people who have come up with creative ideas of how to get these target and vulnerable populations, vulnerable to the ridiculousness of the man, if you ask me, how to get them to agree to take this vaccination. So let's talk about the proposals that are on the table. So-called cannabis activists in Washington, they are offering free bags of marijuana to people who are willing to take the COVID vaccine. And this has caught on because they're doing it in other areas as well. They have a really cute name for the program. Get this. It's called Joints for Jabs. Isn't that cute? joints for jabs. Really catchy. Now, obviously people who don't have problems affording high quality marijuana aren't going to be really incentivized by getting a bag of weed to get a vaccination. So this is literally targeting people who have drug addictions, but not the money to supply them, and offering them their drug of choice, in this case, marijuana, to get a vaccination. It's a cute idea. Oh, but it gets better. Let me ask you a question. Do you need a stimulus check? Would you be willing to get a COVID vaccine, in exchange for a stimulus check and not get a stimulus check if you didn't get the vaccine? Well, maybe you would if you were desperate for money. And fortunate for you, we have a wonderful entrepreneur / ex-presidential candidate from the 2020 election cycle, aka former Democratic congressman, because these white liberals, they tend to be the most racist and twisted of all. He came up with this wonderful idea of basically holding stimulus checks hostage until people take their COVID vaccine. This is the rundown. So basically, the government would get this system where you'd get a number once you got your vaccine. And then once you got your I've been vaccinated number, you would then submit that and your social security card to the United States government, who would give you a big ol' attaboy by giving you stimulus money. Now, never mind that poor people have lost their jobs because the government has forced them in a position where they cannot work. After they create a problem where you're suffering even more than you were suffering previously, they can now strong-arm you into doing what they want by hanging money over your head that arguably you should be getting if they're not allowing you to work. What's funny is that just like saying that some populations were too white to get the experimental vaccine, Delaney has absolutely no issues whatsoever with admitting that it's manipulation. He's literally quoted as saying, "It's not like we don't pull levers to get people vaccinated. We do that now. We already manipulate you. We already force you. We already coerce you into vaccinations. So what's the big deal with paying you to get one or withholding money if you don't?" He cites the fact that you can't use government-funded public schools unless you vaccinate your children. I'm sure many of you parents have learned that. So you want the service? You want the benefit? Well, then you do what we want you to do. When I first heard of this idea of paying people in order to coerce people to do something that you wanted them to do that could be detrimental to their health, it immediately made me think of the many instances in history where medical violence was done toward people with cash incentives. Let's take a moment to revisit those days. The first thing that came to mind was the forced sterilization campaigns, which took on a bunch of different forms. There were times when people were simply sterilized without their knowledge, but then there were other times when they were incentivized. And the variety of sterilization plans really ran the gamut. And as you can imagine, the populations that were targeted were very similar to the not white enough populations that are being targeted now, which are poor people with low education and low earning jobs. Taking a look at this beautiful map of legislative eugenical sterilization in the United States, you can see that literally almost every single state was on board with this behavior with a variety of policies. In fact, it was really only Nevada that repealed their law, but that doesn't negate the fact that they did have one of these sterilization laws. Something that was commonly used to incentivize people to have medical violence performed against them in these vulnerable populations were incentives. Cash, general incentives, money, payments, vouchers, you name it. And this policy has proven very effective over time, as we can tell from this sweet little chart that somebody made up to let us know how effective it is when you hold money over people's heads to get them to do medically violent things to themselves that they normally would not do. But if you think they're not trying to target stupid Black people, what you should really check out is Tyler Perry, our favorite cross-dressing gay guy, And his rather disturbing interview with some vaccine scientists, where they attempt to break down the logic of exactly why Black people need to jump on board with the vaccine. Because number one, they're down with the peeps. And number two, it could just be that you were too dumb, because we didn't talk to your native tongue, to understand the value of their vaccinations. So, now that they have plans to get you high for vaccines, withhold or give you money for vaccines, and avoid populations that are too white for vaccines, we're going to explain it to you in Negro speak, why you should get the vaccine.
To give you people an idea what a clinical trial is, this concept of developing a vaccine for this virus is not new. This virus, if you recall, maybe we talked about this at some point, is very, very similar to the virus that we had that many years ago caused a disease called SARS. It's almost its cousin. It's so close to each other. So we had been working for years for a vaccine against SARS. So all that data for SARS vaccine was in the background, correct?
So when you talk about it's close to SARS, and we had information already on SARS, right?
And that's in one side.
And research on SARS.
And then on the other side, there was all this research happening on something we call the mRNA technology, which we can talk a little more about because very few people know that this mRNA technology, there's an African-American PhD scientist at the NIH, Casey Corber, which was critical in developing this technique. Which
mRNA, tell me what that is.
Well,
you got to talk to me like
I'm going to defer to my friend.
Yeah, y'all got to talk to me like
because Kimberly describes this in a perfect way.
Good. Talk to me like I'm a 5-year-old because you talk to me like I'm a 5-year-old because you talk to me like I'm a 5-year-old because you talk to me like I'm a 5-year-old because you talk to me like I'm a 5-year-old because you.
He said, "Explain it to me like I'm a 5-year-old." And she said, okay.
And so I think the first thing to know is the difference between DNA and RNA.
Right.
So I like to think of it as DNA is like your blueprint for your house, right? And RNA is like a contractor that kind of gives information about what to do so that the blueprint comes out okay. And so what happened is they mapped out what the virus looks like and found out that there are these specific proteins in the virus, one of which is called a spike protein. And I call the spike protein the gangster spike protein because that little gangster spike protein, that's the one that gets in your cell and makes you sick.
Gangster protein?
And so this is what the technology did. This is so dope. So what they did was they said, what if we made a vaccine that was just an mRNA coding only for that little gangster spike protein? And what if we could introduce that into your body, right? And then have your body develop an immune response that then remembers and recognizes it when it actually gets the virus, right? And so the way that it works is I kind of like to think of it as your friends and your homies in your neighborhood, right?
Man, that hunky muff be messing my old lady. Got to be running coal upside down his head, you know?
Hey, home, I can dig it. No, he ain't gonna lay no more big rap up on you, man.
I say, hey, Sky, Subba say I won't sing. Pray to Jay, I did the same old, same old.
Hey, knock yourself a pro slick. The gray matter back, lot performers down, not take TCB in, man.
Hey, you know what they say? See a broad to get that booty yak 'em? Leg her down or smack 'em, yak 'em. Cole got to be. You know? Shit.
Can I get you something?
Your mofo butter laying me to the bone, jacking me up. Tight me.
I'm sorry, I don't understand.
Cuddy say can't hang.
Oh, stewardess, I speak jive.
Oh, good.
He said that he's in great pain and he wants to know if you can help him.
All right, would you tell him to just relax and I'll be back as soon as I can with some medicine.
Just hang loose, blood. She's gonna catch up on the rebound on the med side.
What it is, Big Mama? My mama raised no dummies. I duck her rap.
So you get this mRNA vaccine, right? It's wrapped up in this little lipid layer that gets it into your cell. Once it gets into your cell, this vaccine, it's the contractor. So it tells the cell, we're gonna make these spikes. You start making the spikes, right? But then your body goes, whoa, 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 wait a minute. This is not supposed to be here. Let me call security.
Security?
Let me call in, you know, all my people, and that is your immune response. So you have these cells called macrophages. They come in to swoop up the cell, but not before your body sends a message to some of these immune cells, like your T cells and your B cells, to create that memory so that when you see this virus come after you later, then you know what to do. So I kind of think of it like, you know, when something happens later, you already got the vaccine and you have these antibodies waiting for something to pop off, and you got the T cells looking around to see what's happening. Then you get hit with COVID, right? But the T cells remember now. They have some memory, right? So they're gonna sit back in the cut and be like, oh, that is not who I think it is. And then the antibodies been waiting for something to pop off, and they're like, oh, no. And they just rush.
I like how she went from yeah to your, because she really doesn't speak that way. So apparently 5-year-olds speak Ebonics. I'm not sure if that was the most insulting thing I've seen in a long time or not, but it brought me back to the whole Biden thing. Remember that? Why this situation not...
Yo, why you ain't been answering your phone? You know why I'm calling you. You have to vote. You know why I don't vote? Why? Because as a black man, I just feel like there's no hope. Our president telling people to go back to China, taking the coronavirus as a joke. And that's the part that frightened me. When you choose a president, it's supposed to be a knockout. Then why this situation doesn't entice me?
Yeah, that embarrassment. All we need is joints, money, and a scientist willing to speak Ebonics, and we're going to jump right on this vaccine thing, aren't we? But in all seriousness, let's talk about the dangers to our people. We don't know about the things we don't know about, but there are a few things we do know. There are specific vaccines that are more dangerous for Black people than others. There was a huge hoopla when a member of the CDC defected, specifically senior vaccine safety scientist from the CDC, Dr. William Thompson. Remember him from 2014? Who came out as a federal whistleblower to expose the fact that the CDC knowingly was giving the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine to children, recognizing that Black children in particular, Black boys, were almost 3.5 times more likely to develop autism if they got the vaccine before the age of 3. Dr. Thompson, a senior vaccine safety scientist for the CDC, testified that his supervisors ordered them to destroy data that showed these facts. It was only a stroke of his conscience because he realized he was destroying a whole population of people that caused the man to step forward and expose this farce. He also exposed that the article that the CDC put in a major pediatric journal denying that the MMR caused autism and an increased risk of autism exponentially in Black children, specifically Black boys, that they blatantly lied. And then the man came with receipts and provided literally hundreds of classified CDC documents to show that what he was saying was the truth. That was 200,000 Black boys that have been damaged because of the MMR that did not have to have neurological damage, simply because the CDC lied. And this is recent history, y'all. This isn't like way back in the 1800s. This is just 6 years ago. During these periods of time, there were Black children born who were pumped with this vaccine. Here in the 21st century, Black boys were disproportionately affected because of the fact that boys are more susceptible to autism than females. Also, when our children are adversely affected by these vaccinations, they tend to get worse neurological disorders than children of other races. They will have co-occurring intellectual disabilities, which means they're not just autistic, they have other problems too, to the tune of 44%, compared to brown or Hispanic children whose range of intellectual disability coupled with autism was far lower at 35%. And of course, the children least affected are white children at 22%. So what they do know is that they will hurt a larger portion of our population than they will their own. And if they can take out almost 50% of our children, well, then they'll sacrifice 20% of theirs. The consistency of this neurological damage has been demonstrated over time when we look at the statistics from 2006 into 2014, when this whole thing blew up and came out, although many of you maybe have never heard of it until recently, if at all. I want to say something. This is not just about the MMR vaccine. Our people, African Americans, are more at risk for neurological disorders from vaccine injury than any other population. So it is absolutely insidious to have a vaccine that has only been trialed for 2 months with 45 people targeted at the most vulnerable population. And I don't mean vulnerable as we're going to get COVID. I mean vulnerable as in if there's going to be vaccine injury that is severe and long lasting, it's going to happen to us. It's going to happen to us at a rate of almost 50%. It's going to affect our male children more than any other population in America. Does anybody else see a problem with this? But let's not think this excludes other people in the diaspora, because this is global. First and foremost, a specific study that was done in Sweden showed that even Somali children had an increased neurological reaction, which brings me to this global phenomenon of trying to poison our community. Let's talk about that and HIV and vaccines for Black Aboriginal people. Now, honestly, this is like something out of a movie, and if it wasn't legitimate, you probably wouldn't even believe that this was going on. But I want you to think about everything that we've just seen regarding how we're being targeted here in the States. The study that was done on Somali children in Sweden, and now I want you to look at what's going on in Australia. So Australia invested a ton of money into a multi-billion-dollar vaccine program for COVID after it came out that their participants in the study were testing positive for HIV. But how could this be, Irene, you ask? Well, let me tell you. They purposely put HIV protein fragments in the coronavirus vaccine. By they, I mean this Australian biotech company called CSL Limited, who was destined to supply 51 million doses of the vaccine to Australia. Now, they're claiming that the vaccine provided false positives because there was something being produced in those people that very closely mirrored an autoimmune disorder, specifically HIV. Nikolai Petrovsky, when he found out this was going on, attempted to warn the government that hey, you guys, you're going to give people HIV. And he did this way before they ever agreed to manufacture this vaccine. But the government didn't care. And it's no surprise why. Who do you think was the target population for this particular vaccine? Well, it was the Strait Islander people and the small amount to the tune of like 35,000 Black Aboriginals that are living in secluded areas of Australia that are left. Now, we know that Australia has had state-sanctioned eugenics programs to literally wipe out all of the Australian Aboriginal population. They successfully destroyed all of the Tasmanians. There aren't even 40,000 of these people in existence anymore. But they're considered a vulnerable population for COVID, so naturally this HIV-laced vaccine was destined to go to them first because, you know, we care so much about Black people. Now, what's really interesting is, remember when we go back to Sister Soldier with the blonde hair who was telling us about the gangster spike protein?
And so I think the first thing to know is the difference between DNA and RNA.
Right.
So I like to think of it as DNA is like your blueprint for your house, right? And RNA is like a contractor that kind of gives information about what to do so that the blueprint comes out okay. And so what happened is they mapped out what the virus looks like and found out that there are these specific proteins in the virus, one of which is called a spike protein. And I call the spike protein the gangster spike protein, because that little gangster spike protein, that's the one that gets in your cell and makes you sick.
Well, now's the time for us to talk about the gangster spike protein that they were trying to infect Black people with in Australia. Just like she described in her Ebony Phonics way, the spike protein was the focus of these researchers in Queensland, Australia. They wanted to use what is called a molecular clamp technology to kind of lock the protein into shape so that people's immune systems would neutralize and recognize the virus. Or recognize, then neutralize. You get the idea. Since COVID spike proteins are unstable because it's a virus, they wanted to ensure that you got the right immune response. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. So they were like, hey, we'll just take the clamp protein from HIV and stick that in the vaccination. Because HIV is a very stable virus. Stubborn. Hard to get rid of. Right? And so they were fully prepared to peddle this HIV-laced virus to the most vulnerable populations in Australia. Because those populations, just like here in the United States, are the priority of the Australian government. And honestly, I could point out situations like this all over the globe if I wanted to make a video that was like 5 hours long. But I think you guys get where I'm going with this. Now, let's talk a little bit about the major players in these shenanigans. First of all, we have Bill Gates, who has a host of rather interesting opinions about the virus. Number one, he's not going to pay for anybody to make it unless they can get full immunity.
Unrealistic expectations. The efficacy of vaccines in older people is always a huge challenge. You know, it turns out the flu vaccine isn't that effective in elderly people. Most of the benefit comes from younger people not spreading it because they're vaccinated, and that benefits on a community basis the elderly. Here, we clearly need a vaccine that works in the upper age range because they're most at risk of that. And doing that so that you amp it up so it works in older people and yet you don't have side effects. You know, if we have 1 in 10,000 side effects, that's way more, 700,000 people who will suffer from that. So really understanding the safety at gigantic scale across all age ranges, pregnant, male, female, undernourished, existing comorbidities, it's very, very hard. And that actual decision of, okay, let's go and give this vaccine to the entire world, governments will have to be involved because there will be some risk and indemnification needed before that can be decided on.
And why do they need full immunity on top of the immunity that they already have? You know, Statute 2818, the one that says that anything from dying to mental or physical injury is not the problem of the vaccine companies. Well, he's not willing to fund anything that doesn't give them absolute immunity because they know it's going to hurt people. And how, pray tell, do they know this, Irene? Because it's happened before.
We partnered with a group at the New York Blood Center and the Galveston National Laboratory to take on the big scientific challenge of coronavirus vaccines. And I say a scientific challenge because one of the things that we're not hearing a lot about is the unique potential safety problem of coronavirus vaccines. Some of those kids who got the vaccine actually did worse, and I believe there were 2 deaths in the consequence of that study. Because what happens is you get immunized, and then when you get actually exposed to the virus, you get this kind of paradoxical immune enhancement phenomenon. When we started developing coronavirus vaccines, we noticed in laboratory animals that they started to show some of the same immune pathology that resembled what had happened 50 years earlier. So we said, oh my God, this is going to be problematic.
When we look at vaccines that were developed for SARS-CoV-1 and MERS in the early part of the 2000s, what we found is that those vaccines were really dangerous. So although the animal testing, the testing we didn't get with this vaccine, although the animal testing showed initially that there was an immune response and antibodies were being created, there were disturbing results when these vaccinated creatures were exposed to the virus in the wild, which is basically what would happen to a regular person. You get a vaccine and then you go out into the big wide world where somebody might actually have the virus or you might come across it. The animals suffered a hyperimmune response, which really brings us back to the question of why anybody would use a virus that causes an autoimmune disorder in a corona vaccine, but we won't digress. Let's just move forward. So these same animals that showed a rather robust immunological response in the form of antibodies also had a huge and rather dangerous side effect, which was that when they were exposed to the virus, they had a hyperimmune response. All sorts of inflammation throughout their bodies, their lungs were particularly affected, and they were also more susceptible to other viruses. It actually made it easier for them to become infected, not just with the virus that they were vaccinated against, but with similar viruses. So in a human study, you might say something like the flu or pneumonia or any virus that would affect you similarly to COVID. So Bill Gates, who, it always baffles me how he's involved in these things. I mean, I guess it doesn't baffle me. We know that he basically owns the World Health Organization. He pulls the puppet strings on almost every government on Earth. And he's made a slew of money, literally doubled his income once he got into vaccinations. But this man has absolutely no medical education at all. Now let's talk about the National Institute of Health and Dr. Fauci. So a little known fact is that the NIH and Fauci have financial incentive to push this vaccine. Let me show you what I mean. And this is from our government's own website. Doctors who participate in vaccine research get royalty payments. And the conflict of interest doesn't matter. This all kind of came to the forefront when patients who took part in clinical trials at the NIH found out that the scientists that were performing those trials received $8.9 million in royalty payments and would continue to benefit financially from their discoveries if pharmaceutical companies or people who make devices were to use what was discovered in their research in their products. It literally took a Freedom of Information Act for this information to even come out because the National Institute of Health was not about to share it with anybody. What was found out at the time is that there were almost 1,000 current and previous National Institute of Health researchers who received annual royalty payments that could reach up to $150,000 per person. All the while, they're taking millions of taxpayer dollars to do the research and then license that research to drug companies who then create products that are peddled to you and I, which no wonder the regulation is so shoddy on these things. But this is where it gets interesting. And we get on old Dr. Fauci, the media's favorite companion. Guess who was one of the 2 leading scientists and researchers involved? That's right, Anthony Fauci, head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. Fauci said, hey, it's not my fault. As a government employee, I have to put my name on the patents. And I'm required by law to get paid for it. He even admitted that he thought it was inappropriate to receive the payments and claims he gave it all to charity, but do we trust this man? Because this is the same dude who never said anything about it until somebody found out because of a Freedom of Information request. And it's not just interleukin-2 that Fauci's name is scribbled all over the patent for. It's this current coronavirus vaccine as well, and many others. And also the National Institute of Health. There's a kickback to them too. So the people peddling this and targeting the Black community are making money off of this vaccine. I guess that's why you only needed 45 people in 2 months to develop it, right? Now, when the National Institute of Health was backed up against a corner and asked, so are you guys going to start to make it public? Who's getting kickbacks for all this? They blatantly said no, they're not going to do it. If you want to know, you have to put in a Freedom of Information request. Because otherwise, they're not going to tell you. So the question is, where does this leave us? There are so many other things I could point out about this vaccination. It is a literal rabbit hole. I just wanted to give you a taste of the tip of the iceberg. Like I said, on my Patreon and memberships page, I will go into other aspects of this, which are even more disturbing, if you can believe that. But at the very least, I would advise that you be cautious. Be cautious and think to yourself, who can I really trust?